It was a quiet Saturday morning, and I found myself standing on the side of a deserted highway. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a soft golden hue over the asphalt. I had always been the adventurous type, and after weeks of being cooped up in my apartment, the idea of hitchhiking across the country seemed like the perfect way to break free. It wasn't that I had no money for a bus or a plane ticket. I just wanted to experience something different, something raw, something real. I had heard stories of people who had set out on journeys like this and returned with unforgettable tales. Some of them were uplifting, others unsettling, but all of them had something in common. They involved strangers, the kind of people you meet when you're alone and vulnerable on the road. The thought of meeting these characters intrigued me, and the allure of the unknown was too powerful to resist. I checked my backpack one last time before I raised my thumb. I had packed light. A few changes of clothes, my journal, a couple of energy bars, and a water bottle. My phone was fully charged, but I didn't plan on using it much. This trip was supposed to be about disconnecting from the world, about living in the moment, not worrying about the next message or email. I wanted to embrace the simplicity of it all. The wind rustled through the trees, and the highway was eerily quiet. No cars, no noise, just the soft hum of nature surrounding me. For a moment, I questioned my decision, but then the excitement surged back. This was it, the beginning of something that would change me. I glanced down the road, hoping to spot the first car that would take me away. And then, after what felt like an eternity, I saw it. A dusty sedan approaching in the distance, its engine growling as it sped toward me. My heart raced. I had read all the warnings about hitchhiking, the dangers, the risks, the possibility of meeting someone who wasn't quite as friendly as they seemed. But I couldn't let fear hold me back. I had come too far to back out now. As the car came closer, I held my breath. Would they stop? Would they even see me? My thumb remained outstretched, a silent plea for help, or maybe just an invitation for whatever was coming my way. The car swerved slightly, then slowed down. My heart skipped a beat. This was it, the first test of my journey. The car pulled over to the side of the road, and the window rolled down. A man's voice called out from inside. "Where are you headed?" I approached cautiously, trying to gauge his intentions. The man behind the wheel was older, maybe in his late 40s. He had a scruffy beard and a weathered face, like someone who had spent years on the road. His clothes were simple, but there was something about him that made me feel uneasy, something I couldn't quite place. "Anywhere," I said, trying to sound casual. "Just out for an adventure." He gave me a nod, his eyes scanning me for a moment longer than necessary. I couldn't quite figure him out. His eyes were dark, almost too dark, and there was a hint of something in his smile that didn't sit right with me. But I pushed the thought aside. I couldn't afford to be paranoid. He unlocked the door with a click, and I climbed into the passenger seat. The car smelled faintly of tobacco and stale coffee. The interior was cluttered with empty bottles and scattered papers, as if the man had been living in his car for a while. The radio played softly in the background, but the silence between us was thick, oppressive. I glanced over at him, trying to make conversation. "So, where are you coming from?" I asked, trying to break the ice. He didn't respond immediately. His eyes focused on the road ahead. After a long pause, he spoke, his voice low and gravelly. Been on the road for years, he said. I don't like staying in one place for too long. Too many memories, you know? I nodded, unsure of how to respond. His words hung in the air, and I could feel a chill creeping up my spine. I'd always loved the idea of meeting people on the road, hearing their stories, experiencing their lives for a fleeting moment. But something about this man felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I could sense that he wasn't just a wanderer passing through. The car bounced over a pothole, and I jolted slightly in my seat. I glanced out the window, watching the passing landscape. The road stretched on endlessly, the horizon disappearing into the distance. The thought crossed my mind again. What had I gotten myself into? Where are you headed? The man asked suddenly, breaking my train of thought. I turned back to him, feeling the weight of his gaze on me. Just exploring, I said, trying to sound lighthearted. I'm not in any rush. He nodded again, but his expression was unreadable. I've been down that road before, he muttered under his breath. Exploring. It can be a dangerous thing. His words sent another chill down my spine. There was something about his tone that was too deliberate, too knowing, as if he had seen things that others hadn't, things that had changed him forever. I forced a smile, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling. Well, I'm hoping for an adventure, not danger. He chuckled softly, but there was no warmth in the sound. Danger's always closer than you think, he said cryptically. The car continued down the highway, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The man's presence was unsettling, his words hanging in the air like a warning I wasn't quite ready to heed. But the road was long, and there was no turning back now. I had started this journey, and I had to see it through, no matter where it led. And then, just as I was beginning to settle into the rhythm of the drive, I noticed something strange. The landscape around us had started to change. The trees were becoming denser, the road winding more sharply, as if we were leaving civilization behind. I hadn't seen any signs or landmarks for miles, and the feeling of isolation began to sink in. I turned to look at the man again, but he was focused on the road, his hands gripping the wheel tightly. His silence was unsettling, and I could feel the weight of his presence growing heavier with each passing mile. The air inside the car felt thicker, as if something unseen was pressing down on us. I glanced at the clock on the dashboard. It had been nearly an hour since we first started driving, but it felt like much longer. The roads had become eerily quiet, and the sunlight was beginning to fade, casting long shadows across the land. The temperature in the car dropped noticeably, and I shivered, pulling my jacket tighter around me. The man didn't seem to notice. He just kept driving, his expression unchanged. I wasn't sure where we were going anymore, but I knew one thing for sure. I was no longer just hitchhiking for adventure. I was starting to wonder if I had made a terrible mistake. The car rolled along the road, its tires humming softly against the asphalt. I tried to settle into the passenger seat, but the strange sensation in the pit of my stomach wouldn't go away. The man, who hadn't introduced himself, drove in silence, his eyes fixed straight ahead, his hands gripping the steering wheel with an unnerving intensity. The only sound was the low crackle of the radio, the static occasionally cutting through the quiet, making the air in the car feel heavier. I glanced out the window, hoping the scenery would distract me from the growing unease that was creeping up my spine. But the trees outside were getting thicker, the road narrower. The landscape had taken on an eerie, unfamiliar quality, as if we were entering some forgotten part of the world. The homes had disappeared, replaced by dense woods that seemed to stretch on forever. It was as if we were driving into nowhere. I turned back to look at the man again. His profile was shadowed, his features hard to make out in the dim light. He was middle-aged, with dark stubble on his face and a rugged, worn look about him. His eyes were fixed on the road, but there was something in the way he stared ahead, something unsettling. It wasn't just that he was silent. It was the way he held himself, like a person who had seen things they couldn't or wouldn't talk about. It made me feel like an intruder in his world. Finally, I decided to break the silence. So, what made you start driving all over the country? I asked, trying to sound casual, but the words felt hollow, like I was trying too hard to sound normal. He didn't answer immediately. His fingers drummed on the steering wheel in a slow, rhythmic pattern, the sound echoing in the otherwise quiet car. For a moment, I thought he hadn't heard me, but then he spoke, his voice low and gravelly. "I've been on the road a long time," he said, his tone distant. "Too long. Sometimes it feels like the road is the only place that makes sense." His words lingered in the air, heavy with something I couldn't quite place. His voice was steady, but there was a hint of something in it, something dark, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I nodded, unsure of how to respond. His answer didn't really tell me anything, but I didn't want to press him further. The silence fell between us again, and I felt it stretch out, growing more uncomfortable with every passing second. It was as though the man was hiding something he wasn't ready to share. The thought made me anxious, but I pushed it aside. I was still a little excited about the journey. After all, hitchhiking was supposed to be about meeting new people, right? But the longer I sat there, the more the discomfort grew. The car was starting to feel smaller, like the walls were closing in. The air felt stale, thick, as if the man's presence was pressing down on me. The radio, which had been playing soft country tunes when I first got in, had now shifted to something more ominous. The static cut through the music, and then the voice of a late-night DJ crackled on the airwaves. "We've got a storm brewing," the DJ said, his voice cheerful. But there was a strange undertone to it, as if he was speaking in code. The kind of storm that makes you wonder what's really out there, in the dark. You might not want to be alone tonight. I couldn't help but glance nervously at the man. Did he hear it too? His expression didn't change, but something about the way he kept his hands on the wheel, his knuckles pale and tight, made me wonder if the words had struck him in the same way they struck me. It wasn't just the DJ's words, though. It was the eerie quiet that surrounded us now, as if the world outside had gone completely still. My stomach churned, and I shifted uncomfortably in my seat. "It's getting kind of late, huh?" I said, hoping to break the tension. "Do you think we'll find a place to stop soon?" He didn't answer at first, and I could feel the weight of his silence bearing down on me. Then finally he spoke, his voice low and almost whisper-like. "There's a place up ahead," he said, his eyes flicking briefly to the rearview mirror. "A place where people like us can rest. But not everyone who stays there makes it out the same." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. My heart skipped a beat, and I looked at him in shock, trying to figure out if he was joking. But his face was expressionless, his gaze still fixed on the road. It was as if he hadn't said anything unusual at all. But the coldness in his voice, the way the words slipped out like a warning, made it impossible for me to ignore the sense of dread that had settled in the pit of my stomach. I couldn't even respond to him. What was I supposed to say to that? My mind raced, wondering if I had misunderstood him, if he was just talking about a motel or a roadside inn. But something told me that wasn't what he meant. He wasn't just talking about a place to sleep for the night. There was something darker, more sinister, behind those words. We drove on, and I tried to shake the feeling that was crawling under my skin. I told myself it was nothing, that I was overthinking it. But the more I thought about it, the more my mind started to spiral. What kind of place was he talking about? Why did it feel like we were heading into some kind of trap? My thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a sharp turn. I looked out the window and saw that we were now on a much smaller road, one that twisted and turned through the trees, almost like a forgotten path. The dense forest around us seemed to close in, the trees so thick that they almost blocked out the sky. The air felt colder now, and the car's headlights barely cut through the dark, casting long, distorted shadows on the road ahead. My anxiety was growing. I could feel it in my chest, the tightness in my throat, the cold sweat on my palms. I wanted to say something, to ask where we were going, to demand answers, but a strange sense of paralysis had overtaken me. I didn't want to antagonize the man, but at the same time, I felt like something was terribly wrong. The quiet tension in the car was palpable, and the road ahead seemed to lead us further into the unknown. I stole another glance at the man. He was still driving, his hands steady on the wheel. His face remained blank, his expression unreadable. But as I looked at him, I noticed something, a flicker of something in his eyes, something cold and calculating, as though he knew exactly what was going to happen next. The storm, the one the DJ had mentioned, felt like it was closing in around us. But it wasn't just the weather. It was the silence, the weight of the unknown pressing down on me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was no longer in control, that the road had taken me somewhere far beyond what I had signed up for. And then, just as I was about to ask him where we were headed, the car slowed. In the distance, I saw a faint light, barely visible through the trees. My heart pounded in my chest. I didn't know where we were, but I knew one thing for sure. Something was waiting for us. Something I wasn't ready for. The headlights cut through the darkness, revealing a twisted, narrow road that seemed to have no end. The light ahead, just a faint glow, looked like a distant campfire, flickering weakly against the overwhelming shadows that surrounded us. I felt the car slow, the hum of the engine quieting as we neared whatever lay ahead. My heart raced, beating in my chest like a frantic drum. I tried to swallow the lump in my throat, but it wouldn't go away. Something about this place didn't feel right. The man's grip on the steering wheel tightened, his knuckles pale and strained. He didn't speak, didn't even glance in my direction. His eyes remained locked on the road, though I could see a subtle shift in his demeanor. The silence was deafening now, thick with tension. I tried to gather my thoughts, to convince myself that this was just a stop, a random place like any other. But deep down I knew I was lying to myself. We turned onto a small dirt path that snaked between trees. The gravel crunched beneath the tires, and the car lurched slightly as it made its way down the uneven road. The faint light I had seen earlier grew brighter, closer, and I could just make out the silhouette of a building through the trees, old and dilapidated, standing alone in the middle of nowhere. My stomach churned as we approached the building. It looked abandoned, its windows dark and hollow, the door hanging off its hinges like a broken jaw. It was a shack, or maybe an old cabin, long forgotten by time and people. But there was a light inside, a weak flickering glow coming from the broken window. It wasn't just an ordinary light. It had an unnatural quality to it, like it was struggling to stay on, fighting against the darkness that surrounded it. As we pulled up to the front of the building, the car's headlights illuminated the yard, revealing a patch of overgrown grass and weeds. The air felt colder now, like an invisible hand was pressing down on me, squeezing the breath from my lungs. My hands trembled in my lap, but I tried to steady them, trying to ignore the sense of dread that had crawled under my skin. "Here we are," the man said, his voice low, almost mechanical. I didn't respond. I couldn't. The words caught in my throat as I stared at the place, trying to convince myself that it was nothing. Just an old house. Just a stop on the road. But the more I looked at it, the more something gnawed at me. This wasn't just an old cabin. There was something wrong with it, something off in the air that made my skin prickle. The man turned off the engine, and the sudden silence that followed felt oppressive, like the whole world had stopped just for us. I sat there for a moment, my heart pounding in my ears. My breath came in shallow gasps, the cold air seeming to seep into my bones. "Are you coming in?" the man asked, his tone impassive. I wanted to say no, wanted to refuse, but my body didn't obey. It wasn't just fear holding me there. It was a strange pull, an inexplicable force that made me feel like I had no choice but to follow him. My legs felt like lead, my feet reluctant to move. But I opened the door, my hand trembling as I gripped the handle. The cold air rushed in, biting at my face as I stepped outside, the gravel crunching under my shoes. The man was already walking toward the door of the building. His steps were slow and deliberate, as if he knew exactly where he was going. I hesitated, standing just outside the car, torn between the urge to run and the overpowering feeling that I was already too far gone to turn back. I looked around, but there was nothing. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, and the sky above was an impenetrable black void of stars. With a shaky breath, I followed him, the fear in my chest rising with every step. The building seemed to grow larger, more menacing as I approached. The closer I got, the more the sense of wrongness intensified. It wasn't just the decay of the place, it was something in the air, something heavy and suffocating that made it hard to breathe. When I reached the door, I paused, my hand hovering just inches from the frame. The man had already stepped inside, but I couldn't bring myself to follow immediately. I wanted to turn and run, to get back in the car and drive away as fast as possible. But I couldn't. It was like something was holding me here, making it impossible to move. Finally, I pushed the door open. It creaked loudly, as if protesting my intrusion, and I stepped inside. The inside of the building was darker than I expected. The weak light from a single bulb hanging from the ceiling doing little to chase away the shadows. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and decay, a stench that made my stomach churn. The floorboards creaked beneath my feet as I moved further into the room. I could feel my heart racing again, each beat loud in my ears. The man was standing in the middle of the room, facing away from me. His posture was stiff, as if he was waiting for something or someone. The stillness in the room was suffocating, and the silence was only broken by the occasional creak of the floor and the distant sound of wind rustling through the trees outside. I took a step forward, and then another, my movements slow and deliberate. I tried to control my breathing, to steady my nerves, but it was impossible. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to leave, to run. But I was frozen, trapped in this strange, oppressive place. "Why did you bring me here?" I finally asked, my voice trembling more than I had intended. The man didn't answer immediately. His shoulders seemed to stiffen. And then, without turning around, he spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "This place has its stories, its secrets. Some of them are meant to stay hidden." I felt a shiver crawl up my spine at his words. There was something in his voice, a coldness that matched the chill in the air. It was as if he knew exactly what this place was, what it had been, and what it still was now. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to steady my voice. The man turned then, his eyes meeting mine for the first time since we had arrived. They were dark, pools of blackness that seemed to swallow the light around them. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, watching me. His gaze felt too intense, like he was sizing me up, waiting for something. "You shouldn't be here," he said finally, his words slow and deliberate, as if weighing each one carefully. "This place has a way of getting into your head. It takes something from you, something you don't even realize you've lost until it's too late." My breath caught in my throat, and for the first time, I felt a true sense of terror. What was he talking about? What was this place? And why was I here? Before I could ask, the door behind me slammed shut, the sound echoing through the room like a gunshot. I spun around, my heart racing, but there was no one there, just the empty doorframe, the outside world now cut off from me. The room felt smaller, the walls closing in, the darkness thicker. The air itself seemed to be pressing against me. I turned back to the man, but he was gone. My pulse quickened, and I moved quickly toward the door, but when I tried to open it, it wouldn't budge. Panic surged in my chest. The door wouldn't open. It was as if something was holding it shut from the other side. I was trapped. A voice, soft and eerie, whispered from somewhere in the room, "You should have left when you had the chance." My breath caught, and I froze. I wasn't alone. Something was here with me. Something I couldn't see. Something that had been waiting. The room seemed to close in around me, and the air felt thick, almost suffocating. My heart pounded in my chest as I turned, frantically searching for any escape. But the walls were like a maze. No windows, no doors, except the one behind me, which now seemed like a trap. My fingers gripped the cold, unyielding door handle, but it didn't move, as if something was holding it shut, something far stronger than me. The voice, soft, whispering, now sounded closer, as though it were coming from inside my own head. "You shouldn't have stayed." I froze. The whisper wasn't coming from the shadows or the walls. It was coming from right behind me. I spun around, eyes wide, but there was nothing. Nothing but the eerie, flickering light above, casting strange, elongated shadows across the cracked floorboards. The stillness was deafening. I stumbled backward, tripping over something unseen, falling onto the floor with a crash that echoed through the room. I quickly scrambled to my feet, panic setting in as I glanced around, every inch of me screaming for escape. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew I was no longer alone. Suddenly, a soft scrape of something against the floor, a sound that shouldn't have been possible, caught my attention. Slowly, I turned, half expecting to see something horrible, something I could not comprehend, but I wasn't prepared for what I saw. Standing in the doorway was the man, his face pale, his eyes black as coal. But there was something different about him now, something darker, something that made my blood run cold. His body seemed wrong. It wasn't just that his clothes hung loosely on his thin frame, or that his posture was unnaturally still. There was a shift, something off about his very presence. "You're not him," I whispered, the words slipping from my mouth before I could stop them. The man, no. The thing that looked like him, smiled, but the smile was far too wide, stretching across his face until it seemed unnatural. It was a grin that belonged to something twisted, something inhuman. His teeth were sharp, like the fangs of a predator, and his eyes glowed faintly in the dark, almost as if they were absorbing the light around them. He took a step forward, his movement slow and deliberate. With each step, the air seemed to grow colder, and the shadows in the room seemed to deepen, pulling in toward him like living things. "You're right," he said, his voice low and guttural, not quite human. "I'm not him. Not anymore." I stumbled backward, my breath quick and shallow, fear crawling up my spine. The room seemed to shrink, the walls closing in, and I could feel the presence of something far worse than I had ever imagined. This wasn't just a man. It wasn't even a human being. Whatever it was something ancient, something that fed on fear, on terror, on the souls of those it trapped. You're... What are you?" I gasped, the words barely making it past my lips. The creature let out a low, guttural laugh that reverberated through the room, sending a chill down my spine. "I'm the one who's been waiting," it said, its voice now shifting, twisting, until it felt like the words were being spoken by something more than one being. "I'm the thing that haunts this place, the thing that calls to those like you." I couldn't understand, couldn't grasp what it was trying to tell me. My mind spun, struggling to make sense of the horror that was unfolding before me. "But you look like him. You looked human," I stammered. The creature's grin stretched wider, impossibly wide, until it seemed to take up his entire face. "That's the point," it hissed, stepping closer. "I take the shape of those you trust, those you believe are safe. I wear their faces, their voices. I feed on your trust, on your belief that you are in control. But you're not anymore." I backed away further, my legs shaking beneath me. The creature's eyes never left mine, locking onto me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I could feel its presence inside my chest, like a weight pressing down on me, suffocating me. "You've been brought here to play a part," it continued, its voice now a blend of hundreds of whispers. "A part in the game I've been playing for centuries. And now that you're here, it's too late to leave. You will never leave." I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. My throat felt dry, constricted, as though something had wrapped around it and was slowly tightening. My chest burned, and I felt the weight of the creature's gaze, like it was digging into my very soul. "I need you," it whispered, its voice like a razor blade slicing through the silence. You're just another pawn in my game, another soul to devour. You'll join the others, all the ones who thought they could escape, all the ones who believed they were safe. The darkness around me thickened, swirling in on itself, pulling the very light from the room. I was trapped, helpless, unable to move or think clearly. The fear overwhelmed me, and for a moment I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. And then, in the deepest part of my mind, a thought surfaced, one I had tried to ignore, one I didn't want to acknowledge. This wasn't just happening to me. This thing, whatever it was, had done this to others before. It had trapped countless others in this same twisted game. They had all come here, thinking they were safe, thinking they were just hitchhiking, just passing through. But none of them had left, and I wouldn't either. I was part of the cycle now. Please, I managed to whisper, though my voice was barely audible. I didn't mean to. I didn't know. The creature didn't respond. Instead, it took another step forward, its footfalls echoing through the suffocating silence. It reached out toward me, its fingers elongated, sharp and clawed, like the hands of something ancient, something that belonged to the dark corners of the earth. Its fingers brushed my cheek, cold and clammy, sending a shock of fear through my entire body. You didn't know, it whispered, its voice now a low, gravelly growl. But you will soon. I recoiled, stumbling away from its touch, my mind screaming for escape, for any way out. But there was none. There was nowhere to go. The creature had me cornered, its eyes burning with malicious satisfaction. And then, just as quickly as it had approached, it stopped. The air grew thick with silence, and for a moment, I thought it might be done. But I was wrong. The creature's smile returned, stretching impossibly wide once more. It leaned in close, its breath foul and rancid against my ear. You'll join the others in time, it whispered. But first, I think I'll have a little fun with you. My pulse raced, my heart hammering in my chest. The walls of the room seemed to close in even further, the shadows growing thicker, suffocating me, until there was nothing left but the darkness and the creature's laughter ringing in my ears. The fear had taken root now, deep inside me, and there was no escape.
I was trapped, trapped in its game, trapped in its world. The only thing left now was to wait for the inevitable, the darkness that would claim me just as it had claimed so many before. And as the creature's laugh echoed in the blackness, I realized this was the true terror of hitchhiking. The road was never really empty. It was always waiting, always watching, always hungry for its next victim. I felt the weight of the creature's gaze, its eyes burning through the darkness, locking onto mine with an unrelenting intensity. My mind raced, thoughts colliding in a chaotic mess as I searched for any possible way to escape. The walls felt like they were closing in even more, pressing down on me, suffocating me with the thick, oppressive air. The shadows moved as though alive, writhing and twisting around my legs, pulling at me, dragging me deeper into the nightmare. But something in me, some primal instinct to survive, kicked in. My heart hammered in my chest as I backed away, stumbling over the floor, my legs shaky and weak beneath me. I couldn't think clearly. I couldn't let myself think. The fear, the sheer terror, was paralyzing. But if I didn't act, I knew I wouldn't leave this place alive. The creature's laugh, low and guttural, filled the room, sending chills down my spine. It stepped forward again, its movements fluid, unnatural. "You can't run from me," it whispered, its voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "You're already mine." I could feel its presence like a dark cloud, looming over me, swallowing up everything in its path. I was trapped, cornered with no way out. But there was one thing I hadn't checked: the door. I turned, desperate, rushing to the door in a panic. My fingers fumbled as I grasped the cold handle again, the surface slick with sweat from my trembling hands. It wouldn't budge. The door was locked, or maybe it was never meant to open in the first place. No, 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 I gasped, pulling harder, but it was as if the door had been glued shut. I was out of options. The creature was behind me now, its breath a low, raspy sound that made my skin crawl. I could feel its presence, cold and suffocating, looming just inches away. I had no choice but to turn and face it. Slowly I spun around, and there it was, its distorted form standing just beyond the dim light, its features twisted beyond recognition. Its smile widened as it took another step forward. "You can't escape," it said again, its voice dripping with malice. "You're part of my collection now." But something inside me snapped. Without thinking, I bolted. My legs carried me forward, despite the panic blurring my vision. I didn't know where I was running. I didn't care. I just needed to get away, to break free from whatever nightmare I had stumbled into. I burst through the room, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The hall stretched before me, endless, like the corridors of some hellish maze. I ran, not bothering to look back. The walls closed in as I sprinted, but the fear of what was behind me pushed me forward, each step harder than the last, my feet feeling heavier with every moment. I couldn't stop now. I wouldn't stop. I didn't know how long I ran. Minutes, hours, maybe longer. The sound of my footsteps was drowned out by the growing roar of the creature's voice, echoing in the hallways, growing louder with each passing second. It was chasing me. It was always chasing me. I turned a corner, hoping for an exit, for a way out, but the hallway just seemed to stretch on forever. The walls closed in tighter, and I felt my breath quicken, my chest tightening as panic began to set in. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't escape. The weight of the creature's pursuit was suffocating, and the very air felt alive with its presence, closing in around me. Then, in the distance, I saw it. An exit. A door, cracked open just enough for me to see the faint light beyond. Hope surged through me, and I ran faster, my legs aching with the effort, my body pushing beyond its limits. But as I neared the door, I felt it. The cold, sharp presence behind me. It was close now. Too close. I reached for the door handle, but as my fingers touched it, a hand, no, a claw, grabbed my wrist, pulling me back with terrifying strength. I screamed, but the sound was cut off by the crushing grip around my arm. I twisted, desperate, and kicked out, trying to break free, but the creature was stronger than anything I had ever encountered. Its claws dug into my flesh, its grip unyielding, like iron. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat a frantic plea for survival. "You can't leave," it growled in my ear, its voice low and predatory. "You're mine now."
I fought with everything I had, but it was no use. The darkness, the fear, it was all consuming. The creature's hold on me tightened, and in that moment, I felt the weight of its power, the crushing reality of my fate. I had thought I could escape, but I was wrong. There was no escape. There was only the never-ending chase, the endless cycle of terror. And then, just as quickly as it had grabbed me, it released its grip. I stumbled forward, confusion swirling in my mind. What had just happened? Was it done? Was I free? But when I turned, I realized there was nothing there. The creature was gone. The hallway was empty. The door was still open, but beyond it, there was only darkness. A deep, suffocating void. I stood there, breathing heavily, my heart still racing. What had just happened? Had I really escaped? Was this all part of the game? Part of the nightmare? I didn't know. I couldn't know. All I knew was that I had to leave. I had to get out of this place. But as I stepped toward the door, I froze. In the darkness beyond the threshold, something moved. a shadow, shifting and twisting, just beyond the edge of the light. I took a hesitant step forward, my pulse racing once again. But then I stopped. A cold feeling washed over me, one I couldn't shake. I could feel it. The creature was still here. It had never left. And then the voice, soft and familiar, whispered from the shadows. "You can't escape me. You never could." In that moment, I realized the truth. The hitchhiking, the road, the whole damn journey. It had all been a trap. From the moment I'd accepted that ride, I had sealed my fate. I had become another lost soul, caught in the web of darkness that had claimed so many before me. And as the door slammed shut behind me, sealing me back into the suffocating blackness, I knew one thing for sure. There was no escape. Not for me. Not for anyone. We were all just passing through. And in the end, we were nothing more than fuel for the darkness, trapped in the endless cycle of fear and despair.